Enjoy a seat at the table for great conversation and good company.
Welcome to And Good Company. I'm Sarah Fiedelholtz. We all know a great dinner party isn't really about the food. It's about the people seated around the table engaging in lively discussions. And Good Company gives you an opportunity to enjoy a seat at the table for great conversations as they happen. I am pleased to again be in the company of Zach Benedict, the principal of MKM Architecture and Design. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So you, this is your fifth time at my table, or at the table, I should say, and I always enjoy really having you here. And usually I don't necessarily have, I give you a theme of what we're going to talk about, but today I do have a little bit more directive because this is part of this happiness definitions exhibit that I've created that's going to be at the Jeffrey Krull Gallery here at the library. And you were kind enough to participate in sharing your definition of happiness on a personal level. But I believe that partly your personal definition of happiness also extends from or has been developed through your work and efforts as an architect and someone who really, what I say, is dedicated to understanding the connection between people and places. And really, you're also one of the leading voices in this lifetime community movement, which is, again, thinking about how to create living environments that work for people throughout their lives and at various different socioeconomic and make what the ideal for what a great neighborhood should be. And you really do think about creating meaningful places for people, which in a sense does think about how they would interact with them and how they would engage that could make them joyful or happy. So what I want to, so therefore that's in the context, we are going to get to your own personal definition, but it's in this context of really talking about our happy place, literally the place. Mm-hmm. So I want you to talk about, let's start with talking about the idea of the quantitative and qualitative research that's been done in terms of like the Aarp Livability Index and blue zones, and how that areas and places really do impact not only our levels or states of happiness, but also our longevity or our countering other different emotions that besides. So let's start with that.
So Blue Zones is kind of an ongoing research project by National Geographic to identify pockets of communities throughout the world that have a high concentration of people that have lived over 100. And what's I think interesting about that is there wasn't a lot of immediate correlation to what I think you would normally consider healthy living in the probably more conventional, traditional sense in those areas, but there has been, and the research has continued to show these kind of common themes between those blue zones. Things like socialization, a good chunk of them grow their own food, and just trying to understand the correlations between their day-to-day activity and routine and the likelihood of you having a longer life than in other communities. It's kind of a global example of the discrepancies of zip code health and well-being.
Right. So the discrepancy of zip code is that your zip code has greater impact than your genetic code on your longevity. And then, but the same thing with when they look at blue zones is that they've said that only really 25% of our how we live or the length of time is dictated by our genes, where 75% is determined by our lifestyle and the choices that we make.
Yeah. And the way I look at it is so that they'll call that the social determinants of health. 20 to 30%, depending on who you listen to, has something to do with access to quality clinical care or genetics. The rest are somehow the result of your everyday routine. And as an architect, I will look at that as to say what the built environment has imposed onto you.
Right.
Because that zip code to me is in some ways is an indictment of those responsible for the design and operation of the built environment. I shouldn't be that easily accurate in understanding how long you'll live based on your address, but I am. And I think that's something the design and the development community has to reconcile, because they bear some responsibility in that.
Right. But before we get into that, looking at some of the things that are that the Blue Zone came up with, so they came up with these 9 lessons.
Yep.
And the areas really are, I mean, they were Okinawa, Japan, the island of Sardinia, and Loma Linda, California, and then the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica, and the Greek island of Icaria. But so yes, a lot of them were your diet. You know, a lot of them were to be, you know, what they said about this idea of hara hachibu, which is to cut 20% of your calories, so that you should stop eating when your stomach's 80% full. But a lot of the 9 lessons that they talked about were having a purpose, and you know, why do you wake up in the morning, and then belonging or participating in some type of spiritual community, and making your life, your loved ones, a priority, and then surrounding yourself with people who have the same way of living or thoughts as you do. And then obviously they include that you can drink, you know, wine. So that would be, you know, you should treat yourself to a happy hour.
Right, yeah.
So if you think about these kinds of things, those are universal if you really think about what the research has shown and what I have found through interviewing the 18 individuals that are participating in the exhibit, is that these are the things that people do help to define their happiness. Having knowing that they have a purpose, knowing that their life has meaning, having family and friends and a connection, being a lot of it, they believe in their faith, and a lot of it is being part of something bigger than themselves. So if these are also these universal truths, okay, and they clearly are impacting our longevity, and also then obviously I think if you're living longer, part of that is because you're happy to be alive and you enjoy your life, because there are a lot of people at certain points where they just are done, you know, they would really say they want to check out. So that vitality. So when you think about these universal truths and you think about this idea of creating an environment that helps us live long, let's now look at this idea of what the design and the communities that you create, in essence, to be able to create a happy place.
I think the common themes of the Blue Zone identified is a wonderful example of things that are easily misunderstood, differentiating between causation and correlation. It's like you always hear the thing, if you have books in your home, your kids will do better in school. Like there's just some osmosis that if I'm around books, which isn't necessarily true. The idea that parents who invest in books are also likely parents who also value education and other
also
things.
read and
right. So
right.
there's a correlation there, but that's not the causal relationship between just being surrounded by physical books.
Right.
The Blue Zone, when it first came out, I think didn't do as good a job as they are now at understanding and explaining to the general public what those correlations are. So yeah, they say to have a happy hour, but if you read the literature that they now provide, drinking a glass of wine by yourself doesn't count.
Right.
Right. But when people first saw that, we're like, oh, see, red wine's healthy. These people, wasn't it at all.
And it wasn't also to drink a whole bottle.
Right.
Right.
Or eating fresh produce is not the same as growing fresh produce. The idea that you're actually actively doing this, and it's an activity that you probably have to babysit and monitor daily, gives you a sense of purpose, a daily task, a
reason
hobby.
to wake up in the morning. Right.
And the byproduct is some healthy food, but just to say that you're going to have produce delivered to your home every day isn't the same thing. So they've, I think over the years now, done a better job of fleshing out these. They also, if you're interested in looking, have a great cinematography presence. There's a lot of this videography of these people. And one of my favorite interviews is they're interviewing this gentleman from Italy, and he said, well, what's the secret of living a long time? And you could tell he thought about it for a while, and he just said, well, I think I just forgot to die. And to me, that was everything. And one sentence is, he wasn't even thinking that way about it. He's like 104, And all he was really thinking about was, I have to harvest crops tomorrow, and we're going to have company over tonight. And it was just not even on his radar. And that's what I think the Blue Zone has done a really good job of trying to articulate to the general public, is it's more than just exercise. And because a lot of these people don't follow those rules. A lot of them are lifelong smokers, drinkers. Like, it's not that clean cut. The one thing that is very clear, though, is they're all socially active, hyperly social active. And there's a lot of value there, clinically.
And so when you think about that in terms of your work in creating even neighborhoods or communities and libraries and developments, how do you use that information, and what art that you do to try to create these kinds of environments that would help with longevity?
It's an interesting book called The Village Effect by Susan Pinker, who summarizes some research that I don't think she participated in. I could be wrong. Talking about what are the top things that can reduce the chances of premature death. And on there is kind of the list of your heavy hitters. Don't drink, don't smoke, exercise, take your medication, lose weight. But the top two are social integration and close relationships, which are different things, but they're number one and number two. And they're clearly number one and number two. And when you talk about our work or the built environment or community development, I don't think you can underappreciate the health and wellness impact these close relationships and social integration have on people's longevity. Blue Zones showed that, but I think you can have a better sensitivity of understanding when you're making decisions about development or community initiatives. Is this increasing the citizens' ability to have these bonded relationships, or isn't it? Is it a neutral decision? And that idea of trying to provide some ease in interconnectivity, I think should be the number one priority, if not the ultimate litmus test of whether or not you're doing something effectively as a designer.
Right. So Susan Pinker, she said that you had to have the importance of face-to-face contact.
Yep.
And she even said that that is crucial for learning, happiness, resilience, and longevity. She says that human beings are hardwired to connect with other human beings, and that these type bonds and feelings of friendship and love, they absolutely do make us happy. So when you think about the importance of creating environments that allow for face-to-face interaction and the growing of bonds, that contradicts everything that we have today about the way houses are built and communities. They're gated communities, and houses have walls and huge hedges so you can't see in them, and people even use natural barriers, big trees or extended long driveways, or people say they want to live where nobody's around. Mm-hmm. I mean, so how does it seems that what we're doing contradicts what we should be doing, or how we should be living.
Yeah, that's the human way, I think. Daniel Kahneman, behavioral economist, he doesn't like that term, but that's what everybody refers to. He has this wonderful section in one of his books about happiness is really a constant struggle in the human brain in juggling memory and experience. And we tend to not have the ability to reconcile the two. It's like you pick where you want to go on vacation based on the memories you want to impose upon your children, and you never really reflect on whether or not you had a good time. You document the experience and you say, see, we did this when you were kids. It was fun, right. I promise. But you don't remember that. The thought experiment he gives is, if you could take an amnesia pill after a vacation, would it change where you'd go? And I've asked a lot of people that question, and the immediate reaction is no. And then you start thinking about, well, yeah, I mean, it was a 16-hour car ride, and when we got there, the hotel smelled funny, and we really didn't have that good of a time.
Right.
We struggle with that as humans. People will say, well, I want to live by myself, but they don't say, I want to be lonely.
Right.
But there's this idea of independence, and there's all these other issues.
And privacy.
Right. I mean, you look at the entire independent living world for senior living campuses. It's based on this idea that your independence is is really tested by your ability to survive isolation, right? That's how we're judging whether or not you're independent. Knowing full and well it's coming from an industry that fully understands the impact of isolation and loneliness, but they're using it as litmus tests. If you need to be around people, you're not independent. Well, we all need to be around people, but we're afraid of what the perception of our independence would change with our peer networks or the general public. So we say things like, I'm independent, I don't need that, you don't need to check on me. Yeah, you do. And the Blue Zones is a beautiful way of showing that you do. Whether you like the sound of that or not is immaterial.
Right. I mean, when you think about, you do need people to check on you and stuff, because I think about that. So I'm single, I don't really, I don't have a significant other. I work at home, it's me and the dog. So I think about that, I sort of think, okay, well, if I slipped in the shower or something, right, how long would it take for someone to realize that something happened to me? And so I have a neighbor who's also, doesn't have family here and is single. And so we joke that if we don't see each other like within, 4 days, because we both have dogs and stuff, that we then will check on each other. Right. And so, he was going camping for a couple of days. So I ran into him and he said, oh, I'm going to be away for a couple of days. So if you don't see me. And it's not the fact of that he has his very independent life. I have a very independent life. But I just think to myself, because if I fell or I couldn't get to my phone, or I think a lot about, this sounds morbid, but I think a lot about if I choke, like if I swallow, right. Because I don't have anyone. So I've got, I got a whole strategy of how I could, create the Heimlich on myself. But it's not that I don't think I'm independent and I can't live by myself, but there is a reality of it that there are certain things that right. we do need that interdependence. And maybe the way I think about it is also how I sort of think about the best relationships with a significant other, is that you're independent in a dependent relationship. So there are certain things that you can expect and certain things you're going to do together, and you have that, what you love to call that reciprocity, right. But you also have things that you are independent about. And yeah. Maybe that's the shift.
I think sometimes we struggle with differentiating can and should. Yes, you can live independent. You can live in total isolation. We got prisoners in this country that live in solitary confinement for over 20 years.
And we look at that, at putting them in isolation and alone, as punishment.
You can look at, so I think it's interesting to look at, there's a lot of really good data and research on the impacts of solitary confinement on prisoners. We preserve that punishment for the most severe criminals. But the fact is 36 million Americans live by themselves. And especially the last 2 years with COVID, we're going weeks on end without physical face-to-face contact, like Pinker will say is so critical. We know the effects that has on your brain cognitively for prisoners. Why we don't correlate that with the impact it has on an older adult community who went the last 2 years without seeing anyone, I think it's naive. I think it's dangerously naive to not understand that as a loneliness epidemic and really try to think through what that means to not only health and well-being, but the economy and the community and the trajectory of cities and towns. And it falls under this inability to differentiate between can and should. You can, but should you? Mm-hmm. I don't think you should. Mm-hmm. And we don't have those conversations enough, I don't mm-hmm. think.
And we don't, and we measure some type of our happiness or success or this keeping up with the Joneses also. If you think about the idea of McMansions, mm-hmm. so the homes are much bigger than they used to be. In 1973, the average newly built home was 1,500 square feet. Yep. 2015, it's nearly 2,500 square feet. Mm-hmm. And, the other interesting thing is they talk about that houses on average used to have 507 square feet per person. Now it's 971 square feet per person. So, and most people in a home, they have their own bedroom, they have their own bathroom, they have their own television. It seems like these bigger houses is so that the less people have to interact as families, and having more space doesn't necessarily make people happier about their homes. And because there's this other factor, one, because then everybody says, oh, get everybody together, and where is everybody? And everybody's off doing their own thing in this huge space, so you're lost. And then the other issue is that what causes people to be happy or not about their homes has to do with keeping up with the Joneses and what their neighbor has. And if their neighbor has, and then, has their bigger house, then they're not as happy with their house. And so it just seems that, like you said, we're doing all of these things that are so contradictory to what we should be doing. Yes, we can have a house that has its own pool and swing set, and now everybody has their own entertainment centers and gyms, and I mean, there's no reason to leave your house now. I mean, you've really built this fortress, but that doesn't mean that that's what it should be.
Well, in some way, I think that's the evolution of the American dream. It's transitioned into what could you do versus what should you do. Right? You're constantly proving what I could do. They said I couldn't do this, and I did it. You hear that conversation a lot more than, I think we should be doing this, so I did it.
Right.
And that has been, I think, the evolution of what we refer to as the American dream, is this idea of could.
And so when you think about, you're having an impact on building environments in which people interact, they live, they go when they need, from everything from a library to a health facility to housing to urban development. So when you think about what we're doing that we think we should do as opposed to what we really should be doing, and what is that, and how do you integrate that into your work?
I think the most important thing for us is understanding that really at its best the built environment is nothing more than a platform for people to interact. To say it's any more than that, I think, is overcomplicating the issue. But then conversely, I think you have to measure the success of any design or development by its ability to foster social interaction. Some within the control of an architect, most not. But things like a destination economy makes impromptu interaction virtually impossible.
Meaning?
If the average Hoosier lives 6 miles away from toilet paper, you're not going to accidentally run into somebody when you're out and about. Like, you get in your car, you drive, you go to a single destination, you get what you need to get back in your car and go home. Where before, in a more traditional neighborhood sense, you would meander down Main Street, end up having to go to 5 or 6 stores, which was such this inconvenience, we changed it to big box retail. And now the inconvenience is chronic health issues, mental disease and depression. So it's really weird how we gauge what's inconvenient. The 6 stores stop was really inconvenient, but obesity and premature death isn't.
Right.
So it's I think understanding what the value is and where the priorities are. But that idea of trying to help nudge social interaction is probably the biggest priority, I think, for people involved in the design and development of neighborhoods. And trying to just make sure people are aware of one another and not so easily let them put up these fortresses of privacy, because that falls into this I can category, without really reconciling it at all with the results of it and the cost of it, both financially and emotionally.
And you talk about the idea that the terms attachment and happiness have become economic terms in terms of, and what do you mean by that?
So you can get a lot more predictive about the growth of a local GDP by levels of attachment of the citizens that live there. So if you look at things like job growth, curb cuts in industrial parks, all these things that we used to measure to say this community is on the rise, none of them are as predictive as if you could pool the entire community and say, well, how many people here would try to convince a family or friend to come move to your community? Say that number is 50%. If you can get that number up to 60%, over the next 10 years, you will likely see a 10% uptick in the GDP. It's more predictive than almost any other indicator. So this idea of attachment or stewards of a community is an important thing to understand. What's more interesting, I think, to me is this idea of the impact social mobility has had on that. So there is, in your discussion of happiness, there is people have a biological set point. Some people are just happier than others.
Right, that's genetic.
Yep.
Yep. Okay,
It's not
got
all
that.
of it, but that's part of
Right,
it.
right. And then-
Those people are, by a large fraction, more likely to relocate.
Happy people?
Yeah, move to other communities.
Because they think that there's more
Optimistic.
opportunity, they're
They're just
optimistic.
optimistic by
right,
nature.
Right,
They're adventurous, they're optimistic. Those are the ones that will move. So where they go is interesting, because not only are these in-migration reports so interesting from an economic standpoint, you'll hear it all the time, but what if I told you that everyone moving is optimistic and happy too?
right, so then who's left?
Exactly, right? Who is left? So to say that we're going to solve all these problems in failed Rust Belt communities without talking about the fact that the reason these conversations have been so increasingly difficult over the last 20 to 30 years is because they're also the result of social mobility and the fact that the optimistic people have left.
Right.
They're
well,
gone.
just by nature of thinking that you live in a rust, and when you're, it's sort of like, if you keep telling someone that it's not good, it's not nowhere to go, there's nothing to do, there are no jobs, they start to believe you.
Right.
So,
And those communities didn't say that about themselves 20, 30 years ago, but they had a better balance of happy and grumpy people.
Right,
right? There was this better balance.
right.
So there is a cost to this social mobility, and that's one of them. It's why those cities that have such a high in-migration are so exciting. It's not just because people are moving there, it's a certain type of person
Okay.
who is stereotypically moving there.
So what's a community that you think is seeing this, exciting inward people moving there, and that you can see direct results of happy people being there?
Well, I mean, I think all of the success stories of the last 15, 20 years, Austin, Texas, Nashville, all these places where at first when you heard about it, you're like, why is everybody moving to Austin, Texas?
Right.
There's a good book called The Big Sort that kind of talks about moving around to people that are like you. And once the town has a reputation of where you go, if you're willing to move at all, to a certain cohort, the technical term is amenity-seeking migrants, right? That's the technical term, but it's people that are moving based on the quality of life. Like, what am I going to do when I'm there? And those are the same people that'll test off the charts as, disproportionately happy. And in some ways, I don't have the numbers memorized, but Fort Wayne has had a large in-migration over the last couple of years. Of all the Midwest states, I think Indiana was the only one that had a positive in-migration last year. So that's not nothing either. Like, to understand what that could mean for the region, and how do you onboard those new people as quickly as possible to become a part of the community,
Right.
so that you can leverage
Right.
that
Because if they
optimism
don't
and
feel,
happiness.
because like if you bring someone here, recruit someone for a job, and their significant or other does not, or spouse does not feel attached to this community in 3 to 6 months, they're not going to stay.
Correct.
So you've got to do those things for that, to help that attachment. But when you think about then all of the developments, because you think about what's happening in Fort Wayne, so you think about all of these new, I cannot call them neighborhoods, but these they're developments, housing developments, and then, or the affordable housing, the huge affordable housing developments that we see happening, or even downtown, the development in terms of building of apartments and stuff. When you think about those, are we doing the right type of development and neighborhood creation in order to understand that these things that we have to create for people and for them to not only be attached but happy and live longer? Do you think that what we're doing is caught up with, again, what we should be doing?
I don't know. I don't think you can create a neighborhood. I don't think you can just say, here's a neighborhood, have fun. But I do think you're providing them with tools that the neighbors can leverage to create a certain type of community, for good or bad. I don't know if we're having honest enough discussions of how long that should take, right? So as a designer, I can do the best thing in my entire career. This project is as good as it's going to get for me. But as soon as I'm done, I walk away,
Right.
and I leave it up to the users to determine how to use that platform. The question is, how are we onboarding those leaders within those neighborhoods to make sure that this product which the reason it is what it is outside their control. Finances, investment, land acquisition, there's all kinds of these variables. But how are we going to ensure that we're going to use this tool and leverage it as most effectively as we can so that this becomes a real authentic neighborhood in the quickest amount of time possible? And that, I think, is hard to be prescriptive about because it's so personal to local players.
Right.
But to me, that's that's what you'll see in all real success stories. Is, well, there was 3 people that moved Earth to make this happen.
Right.
They had 3 different agendas. They were 3 different personalities, but they had one common goal.
So MCAM, you're involved in a pretty big development now here in Fort Wayne, right? What is that one? What is it?
Village Premier.
Okay. So when you, knowing all this, and now you're building this thing and knowing what you know and all this research, what are you doing in order to ensure that it can afford to sort of become, in essence, it's a blue zone?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things that are important to me. One is understanding the kit of parts. I don't get to make that up. So I know I have X amount of apartments, X amount of townhomes. I know what the kit of parts are. And largely I don't get to change that.
Right, because that's dictated by the land and how the land has to be parceled in order for the economics,
yeah, and economic sustainability and just all these. So to a certain degree, I have to accept that for what it is. The question is, how are you going to use these parts in a really meaningful way? I think there's 2 things that are really critical that we try to do as best we can to understand. One is equity, trying to understand what that looks like in terms of qualifying a platform that is not only welcoming but accommodating for people to act on their own, for all ages, all abilities, all personalities. The other is diversity, and I don't mean it necessarily in the conventional sense. I think one of the most important things people underestimate is the diversity of time. So you'll say mixed income development for a mixed income neighborhood. That's great, but the reason that's valuable isn't because we have a diversity of median household income. It's that you likely have a diversity of routine. People are coming and going at different times of the day. It's the reason that nonviolent crime is higher in gated communities. Everyone leaves and comes back at the same amount. If you were going to case the joint and try to rob somebody, that's a lot more predictable place to entertain that idea than a neighborhood where people are just coming and going all day long. And once you can guarantee that diversity of time, which you can in a mixed income development, then the question is, well, can I spread this out enough that that movement now is leveraging this platform for social interaction? So not only is it trying to alleviate this perception of silos of poverty and that, but you're also using that diversity of occupant as a way to diversify the activity and thinking about the development in terms of when you see a site plan for a development, you can look at that as something that is useful to quantify square footage, or as a verb diagram. Like, what are people doing? They're, I'm going to talk to my neighbor here. This is where I will propose. This is where I'll do an Instagram photo. This is a great place for snowball fights. Like all these kind of activities, uses, things people are going to use the platform to do things. If I can spread those out and at the same time overlay that with this network of people that are coming and going all the time, now you got a neighborhood.
But do you also think then about front porches? Do you think about making sure like people, like garages are put like back in alleys?
Well, the beauty about a front porch is all it's doing is leveraging that activity diversity. Right. You're coming and going, and I want to people watch, so that front porch is great for me because I can see things going by. I can engage who I want. I can spy on people I want. That whole dynamic. And what a front porch does and why it was so critical is it gave this really effective aperture from public to private space. Right? I control that barometer as opposed to now where since COVID happened, I'll order food, it shows up, I'm not supposed to talk to them, they leave. Right? This whole kind of weird scenario where before, if air conditioning ruined this, but you'd sit out on the porch to escape the hot house. But everyone did it. So Now you're in this kind of really interesting, intimate, semi-public zone, the street was. And you could catch up with people, do the 2-minute, how's the weather type conversations. And all that was doing then was leveraging that diversified time and giving people a platform for interaction. As soon as that went away, it became more difficult. Still possible, but a lot more difficult. You didn't have that nudge, that platform, that springboard to do that. And that's why the front porch still works to this day, and why it was so detrimental to the health of people that live in communities that abandon that idea.
And what about the idea, though, are you, as you think about this development, are you thinking about the idea of third spaces? And are the homes that you're building, are they smaller in square footage so that there isn't it, or maybe even the types of rooms? Like nowadays, people don't want a formal dining room anymore. You know, maybe they want more of a home office.
Right.
Or so when you're looking at this, and you're really doing this right now, what are you seeing and what are you creating, and how do you ensure that this is going to be really a mixed income or mixed time kind of environment? And like you said, once you leave, giving the tools, but you're creating this now, knowing everything you know and everything. How are you doing it?
Well, one is trying not to be too prescriptive on the unit, because I think that diversity, you know, that's the bottleneck, is the unit size. To say that, well, it's an urban neighborhood, so we should only do 1-bedroom apartments. Yeah, we could, but if I want to have a really broad range of personalities and family types, I need some 3 bedrooms. I need some studios, and I need them to be so intermingled you can't tell which one's which.
Right. And I think that's partly sort of the issue with the landing apartments, because they're all studios or 1 bedrooms, and I need a home office, so I need another bedroom.
And it's interesting when you talk about this kit aparts you start with. The problem with the landing, which we worked on, was the historic buildings were landlocked, so you don't have the ability to have windows around the perimeter of the building, and it's just hard to get 3-bedroom units. So now with Village Premier being 100% new construction, that restriction now disappears.
So now where is Village Premier being built? Because
just south of McMillan Park.
Okay, so it's, and in the area that it's being built, is there already, like what I always say, you know, to create a thriving neighborhood, you know, you sort of need a dry cleaner and even some kind, I mean, now we can't even say a little, just like a little market or something. So are those things already there that have what, you know, that kind of nature to it? Or are these things also you're going to have to create because it is, you're thinking of what, because that's what I would define as an urban environment.
There's some retail adjacent to the development. Village Premier, within its scope, will also have some commercial space. I think the hope is right now, if we can achieve it, is that that function will likely be more clinic, daycare functionality, as opposed to just conventional retail.
So services for the people who live in the neighborhood.
Correct. At a scale that it also could bring in people from outside the development.
Then how big is the development going to be?
In unit size, about 240 total apartments, townhomes, detached single-family homes.
So when you think about making the spaces more, you know, fluid, or that they can be interpreted for people's uses, what does that mean? Like, what do we, you know, I'm sort of saying, because this is really, to me, this is an opportunity, and I'm sort of holding you know, to the feet to the fire, because it's, again, it's like when I had you do that exercise of, okay, what would be the perfect downtown if you were going to create it? You really have an opportunity now to create. Granted, there are all these limitations of the type of living environment that can foster the things that we're talking about. So I really want to understand, so what are you doing, and how are the homes, when someone goes to look at a home at Village Premier, is going to seem different, like, you know, than going to see another home?
Well, I don't know.
I mean, are there going to be like are you using more, like, are there walls that are sort of, I don't know what you call it, but the slide, you know, like the farm door, so that you could sort of pull out and have a wall, or slide it back? Is it more that you're going to have, you know, everybody talked about that open concept room, but then there are, you know, I guess like moving walls. I mean, I don't know. I mean, because really, or is it more are you really integrating more? When everybody talks about the smart house and technology for good or bad, are you using that more? Are you creating not only a front porch but back porches? Are you giving all of the apartments and townhomes balconies? I mean, what are the things that when you think about designing this, and you know, I mean, more than I think most architects, and that's why I like having you here, is because you really do understand so much of the sociology and the psychology and everything that goes into creating happiness and longevity in creating this ultimate happy place.
Yep.
So what are you doing, or what have, you know, or you've talked about like in the Piper Trail where you have these little clusters and so people can see. I mean, so are you putting like parks or little gathering places? Is there a trail, you know, to like, you know, from your best concepts? I mean, I sort of feel like, you know, this is an opportunity for you to put that. So that's what I really want to understand.
First off, I don't think perfection's the goal.
No.
Well, but sometimes you'll get that question is, what would make this perfect? I don't even like the grammar of that question. The first step is listening and just trying not to talk. So we're kind of in that mode now, meeting with neighborhood groups, open houses, design charrette type of discussions. But even those, I think it's important to try to frame what we want to talk about versus what need to be accepted kit parts that we're dealing with. There'll be certain limitations to the apartments. We're entertaining this idea of some integrated green technology. We'll probably end up having some units that have some space flexibility for working at home, pocket doors, soft space, that kind of thing. But where
I would say better construction of the walls between the apartments.
Right, yeah,
I mean,
and that kind of stuff I think helps with the longevity of the product, but it isn't part of the discussion of how fast can this become a neighborhood.
Right,
you do them at the same time.
Right, but I also think that it's important not just for the building of the apartments that they're going to be in, that can be a neighborhood onto itself. Like I think about, I live downtown in a building, it's only 4 stories, and I think about that they don't give us opportunities even on our floor. Like there's opportunity where they could there's a big area right by the elevator, and they could put 2 chairs and a table. Like during COVID, we had this kind of thing where everybody sort of opened their apartment door and like hung out in the hallway and stuff. And then when people would come off the elevator, they would just be
okay,
naturally.
so this is great. So my question to that is, what would happen if you put 2 chairs and a table there?
Well, the hope would be is that somebody would sit there, right?
Well, but structurally, does someone in 5 days take it away and it disappears? Do you get reprimanded for doing it? What would happen?
Right. Well, that's the issue we have in my building now about carts, about giving carts for us to use.
But that's a great example of this idea of providing a platform. So you know it's a neighborhood when people have such ownership in it as a place that they're not waiting for someone to do that.
Right. Well, we did it. We all sat on the floor, or people had those folding chairs that they brought to soccer games, and yeah.
So, and then, you know, the old saying, if you want a pavilion in a park, you put a picnic table there, and over time that becomes a pavilion. Having opportunities and places for the community to start to adjust and then adapt the place is, like, I think, the first telltale sign that this now has transitioned from the honeymoon phase of a development to an actual neighborhood.
Okay, so would a perfect example of that be, like, so where I park my car, right? So there's a sidewalk, and there isn't really a way, they didn't think of a way of how people need to get into the parking garage because it's by the gate, but there's a big patch of grass, and you can see the pathways that people created so that they could go into the garage and go to the stairs, because the way they want you to go is really not working. So is that what you mean, like where you see those kinds of things where people...
You can tell it with language. So when people say, the landlord did this, or our building is going to do this, like they're very different things. It's hard to do as an individual. It's a lot easier to do as a group.
So how do you create and foster an environment that's like has that flexibility or fluidity for people?
Well, part of it's spatial. Like you need to provide square footage. I mean, sincerely, you need space.
Right, but
to
most
have-
developers, wouldn't they tell you that if you said, okay, we want to put like a grassy knoll, okay, you know, maybe not, and leave it there, they would say to you, yeah, but I could put another house there.
Right, and they will. And if that's the question you ask, that's the answer you're going to get.
Okay, so what's the question you have?
Like if two buildings by fire code need to be 20 feet apart, my first question is, well, what are we going to do in that 20 feet? I have to give you 20 feet of green space there. I can't fill it with a unit.
Right.
So what am I going to do with it? Do these buildings need to move so that green space is better?
Or
Could
maybe
they move?
or maybe they have a door in each of them that goes, that you can get out to the green space.
Correct, but
Right.
I have to give you that green space.
Right.
So it's not a question of can we have it.
Okay.
It's, well, here's the things the green space now becomes the kit of parts. I have to have a green space.
Okay.
How am I going to do this in a way that it will become a place where people take
Right.
it over and start to
Right.
manage it themselves?
Right. So when you would have that discussion, right, with, I guess it's really the developers, right, because they're the ones. So whose responsibility is it to, one, have that discussion and ask those questions, or think about the fact if you would put a door, like from these buildings to this green space? I mean, some people, like in my building, I mean, the alleyway, unfortunately, they use because they can't smoke inside.
Mm-hmm.
But thinking about that too, like, okay, if we know that people can't smoke in the apartments, yet they're still going to smoke, then maybe we need to create an area, you know, that could be for smoking, and then that wouldn't, and then give them the trash cans and everything. So, you know, but thinking about what you need also, that so it doesn't just become this empty, like wasted space, or maybe you could turn that into like a little dog park run or something. I mean, whose job is it then to push these things forward and to think about that? You, okay.
I think so.
Okay.
But I think to achieve them, you have to be realistic about what is the metrics we're going to define whether or not something's possible.
Okay.
There's just a beautiful mural that just got done on the landing.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, with the floral.
Right.
Yeah.
That was a wasted space.
Well, no, but they've activated that way because it's.
No, it was designed to be activated, is my comment. That new building could have abutted that, and we could have got extra units and extra square footage.
You mean you could have just gotten rid of that little where
whole
Mercado
alley,
uses
yeah.
for outdoor?
Yep. Right? And I probably could have got them one more extra apartment.
Right.
But then you would lose all that civic space, all of the views of that framing of that outdoor dining area,
Right.
this wonderful canvas that we identified on day one as a potential
Right,
mural.
because you were solving also a problem that there were no windows or anything
Correct.
on that wall, and it just
Correct.
looked like this steel.
Right.
Yeah.
So that became well, we have to do this, versus, well, if we have to do it, which side of the building do we want it on?
Okay.
How can we leverage it? How does the design of the building now allow that future restaurateur,
Right.
who at the time we didn't know who it was, activate that space on their own terms well enough that when you drive through it, you would assume all this was intended.
But part of it was intended because part of the landing was to have these the third space, right? That's partly why the apartments
Right.
were a little smaller.
But I can't tell you with a straight face that I have any control over how that materializes. All you can do from a design and development standpoint is nudge. Right? Once I give you that space and we try to set up a culture where we're going to give you permission to use it, then the goal is just to try to make sure you get people that are going to creatively use it.
Okay.
I didn't decide. No one asked me what that mural should be,
Right.
right?
Right.
It's fantastic. It's gorgeous. And that's the nudge, right? And you start nudging that and elevating the quality of what a mural is in downtown, which we did with the first one, which was on Nawa. Then it sets the stage, well, this one has to be just as good because the neighborhood said so, not because I said so or you said so. And now we're off to the races. Now the landing is a neighborhood that has these kind of iconic features that the community rolled up their sleeves and got done after the development was done.
Right.
And that's when you know, okay, this is going in the right direction.
So when you're thinking about the Village Premier and you're thinking about creating a happy place, what are the things that you're going to give or think about to give that nudge?
This is where you're not going to like my answer. I don't think I can make someone happy. What I can do, I think, is there are strategies I can employ to reduce misery and loneliness,
Okay.
which aren't the same thing. So what is the Benjamin Franklin quote? The Constitution protects the pursuit, it doesn't provide it.
Right.
There's a difference between the protection and the provision of happiness. So I can protect that pursuit by trying to limit misery and loneliness. And there are, I think, spatial cues and evidence on the design side of how you could reduce someone's sense of loneliness and depression and misery, which I think by default increases the likelihood of you being happy.
Okay.
But I'm not as bullish to say I'm the one. We can make design decisions to make people happy.
Right.
I don't think that's
Well, that's the whole issue of how do you define quality of place? What's quality to one person isn't to another. But with everything that you know and you've studied and thought about, there are certain things that you definitely can do in this space that would help that nudge or give them that opportunity, right?
To reduce the sense of being alone.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So what are some of those things that you're going to do?
When we map out a development of this size, what you're really trying to map out is the transitions between public and private space.
Okay.
The more transitions, usually the better. Not always, but you're looking for a quantity of transitions, but also then the overlap of transitions. So that's what a porch does really well. But if that's all you had, you only have that experience at one scale.
Right. So would that also be like sidewalks?
Sidewalks, civic platforms, public space, commercial third places like cafes.
Mm-hmm.
Public libraries are great because they're free and civic. But now I've had that experience of impromptu nudging and interaction at different scales. My own home, which I kind of sort of have control over, my front porch, to the sidewalk, which is a little less out of my control, to a public library who anyone can go in without the expectation of buying anything,
Mm-hmm.
to a coffee shop.
Mm-hmm.
Now I have these experiences at different levels and scales. If I can do that within the course of my everyday routine, now we're on to something. So there's three key types of places in your kit aparts. First place is home, second place is work, third place is a social hub,
Mm-hmm.
or like the Cheers song, everybody knows your
Mm-hmm.
name. A better way to think about it, I think, is the first place is home, needs to function as a realm of privacy. Second place is work, which really just means a realm of purpose, paid or unpaid, doesn't matter. And then third is a realm of fellowship. And what does that look like? How those triangulate in your everyday routine is pretty good predictor of how happy you'll say you are. It's not impossible, but people that have two out of those three and the third one never exists,
Mm-hmm.
it's very unlikely that that
Mhm.
person will self-identify as happy. Not impossible,
Mm-hmm.
but it really shoots the probability down to nothing. So when you have a development of this size, as opposed to just a one apartment building,
Mm-hmm.
you now do have a little bit more responsibility and opportunity
Mm-hmm.
to start moving these things around and saying,
Mhm.
well, if I move this 50 feet that way, now I'm within some magic distances. I'm within the emotional field.
Right, of how someone can see someone, right? It has
So
to be.
there's
yeah,
all this
the
kind of,
field, yeah,
it's a lot of circles. And,
Right,
you know,
right.
which doesn't apply to everybody, but general rule of thumbs, I bet I could, if I move this 50 feet this way, I bet I can gauge that entire half of the development, where if it's over here, it won't work and only my extroverts will get this
Right,
far through
right.
the development. And trying to play through some of that data and research. But all you're doing then is trying to assemble a map
Mm-hmm.
that you hope people want to maneuver through.
Mm-hmm.
It's not to say that's perfect.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Um,
Well, because also, like I said, you might think they're going to go this way, but they're going to create
they
a path.
won't, yeah.
So, but are you having these types of conversations and looking at these types of issues and thinking about these things of attachment and happiness, and while you are thinking about the square footage and what the building's going to look like and the homes, and are these the conversations? Because you started this by saying that it's also what are the conversations we're having, and also the questions that we're asking. So I'm wondering, are you doing that with this type of project?
Yes. So I know I think about them subliminally. I'm not in the mode right now yet on this project to tell you what it looks like
Okay.
aesthetically.
Okay.
I'm sure I am, but I don't know
Okay.
it. But what I am in the mode of right now is identifying what the kit parts are, which is what you're really trying to do when you're listening.
Right.
I can't promise you we can afford an aquarium.
Right.
But what I'm hearing is you need a civic identity, iconic commercial presence, whatever that is. And at the same time, how can this kit of parts be arranged spatially in a way that we can do the best we can at alleviating a sense of loneliness?
So when you have the sketch or the blueprint or something, I'm inviting you to come back with it.
Okay.
And I want to have a conversation where all these things that you and I have talked about, because this is our 5th conversation, and they all pretty much have the same theme.
Yep.
I want to then be able to look at it and say, okay, why this? What's this? And literally we'll map it out here. So I hope you will do that, because I would love to really sort of ask the questions and have that conversation.
Yeah, love to.
And again, a lot of times I just want to ask because I just want to make sure it was thought of.
Yep.
And I guess also because of who you are and because I know you and you as one of these very thoughtful and person who really is curious, and I'm very interested in seeing how you literally can take all of your ideas and experiences and thinking, and because now you've got a significant place to put it to work in a sense. And also to learn where there were, why you couldn't do certain things. And, there's always things we have to make adjustments for, but I hope you will come back and do that for me.
As long as you're willing to share in my wonderfully miserable process of...
Yes, but out of that, I know that in your wonderfully miserable process, you are the happiest.
Yes.
So, see how we tied that back? Right, see?
Completely.
See how we tied that back to our whole theme?
Completely.
Now, as you know, at the end of each show, I ask questions that to help reveal about you. But you have gone through most of the questions that Marcel Proust had, and then some other ones. So I have created a list of things that I want to know. Really, these are my questions about that I've had a conversation with. So, what 3 words best describe you?
Sarcastic, sincere, thoughtful.
What is something that you are obsessed with and why?
Being better.
What is your favorite number and why?
Oh, geez. 14.
Reason?
Anniversary.
What is something you bring with you everywhere you go?
Phone.
What 2 questions would you ask to get the most information about a person, who a person truly is?
What's the hardest thing you've ever done? What's the best book you ever read?
By what standards do you judge yourself?
By my actions, not my intentions.
What is the number 1 thing on your bucket list?
Go to Europe.
Is intelligence or wisdom more useful?
Oh, wisdom.
How likely do you think it will be that humans will last another 1,000 or 100, based on where we're going, years without killing ourselves off?
How likely? Not very.
How long do you think you will be remembered after you die?
Depends how good of a storyteller my sons are.
What hard truths do you prefer to ignore?
What hard truths do I prefer to ignore? Hardship.
What do you think is the biggest threat to the social contract in our country?
The villainization of intelligence.
Well, I want to thank Zach Benedict, the principal of MKM Architecture and Design, for coming back and hopefully helping me on my mission to continue to support intelligent and meaningful conversations.
Thank you for having me.
And I've already invited you back for your next conversation, so I know you will be here. And you can learn more about And Good Company and all the other great conversations we have had at andgoodcompany.info. And we look forward to next week when you can again enjoy a seat at the table for great conversation and good company. So,